Hello everyone, today we make a brief consideration, brief relatively of course, given the average length of my videos, on the essentially the factors that brought at in the end of the Carolingian Empire to expose Europe to the so-called second invasions. We will mostly concentrate on, well no actually on all the Carolingian or post-Carolingian territories fundamentally, and observe in very general terms today those factors that in fact made these lands so vulnerable to the attacks, to invasions, and in a certain sense weren't able to cope with them evidently. I mean, even if, and this is fundamentally also what the history of the Carolingian Empire has been, and as long as the empire was standing, even when fractioned after the 40s of the 9th century, in multiple parts. Actually, this happened also before, but when there was this initial disgregation, the single kingdoms had managed to respond to the enemy threats. We're talking about obviously the Vikings, the Saracens, and the Hungars, of course, and each one of these kingdoms attempted fundamentally to put up a resistance, an efficient military system that could cope with this new threat. But in general, it's overlooked. I mean, in many ways, how this crisis fundamentally happened from the within. I mean, how, and this is valid actually for all great empires that at a certain point crumbled, apparently because of these terrible invasions that came out of nowhere. As if one day these peoples woke up and said, okay, what do we do now? Well, let's go raid and destroy empires. It's not how really the balance worked. And you can interpret this, at least this is my opinion, and of course I've been reading these things for quite a time now, but doesn't make me an expert, because personally I'm not an expert on the Carolingian Empire nor on the Roman Empire proper, but I formed my own opinion through the course of the years, that fundamentally this collapse has to be understood not just as a mere internal crisis of the empires, in this case of the Carolingian Empire, but in a certain sense the invasions that were definitely active and were actively damaging and were making a substantial difference in the equation, into the system, were triggered by the internal crisis that already occurred within these political entities. And this is quite evident in my opinion, especially now bringing other examples. Now, the one of the Roman Empire is kind of the quickest, because everybody knows that, and the Carolingian Empire also geographically is kind of relatable, fundamentally compared. The Roman Empire was fundamentally a Mediterranean empire. There were certain provinces of continental Europe that were actually pretty well functioning. It's not a surprise. In fact, we've seen in many videos on Schwerpunkt that part of the Merovingian and later Carolingian legacy was, in fact, I mean, not legacy, but let's say the fortune was essentially, it derived from the Roman legacy of the Gauls that had not been fundamentally altered in the passage between the let's call it late antiquity and early medieval times. The worst naturally, but this is a detail, but you realize that it said the Carolingian Empire was much more shifted towards continental Europe. It came to encompass vast and important, also economical and culturally speaking, southern European lands, but it was kind of shifted. But the overall picture is kind of similar. You have this massive, fundamentally European empire, because that's also what it was. I mean, the Mediterranean elites during the Roman Empire were fundamentally either Latin or Hellenic origin, and the same Mediterranean was ethnically very different from, I mean, not actually very different, at all. But in terms of ruling classes, was fundamentally different. In what we think about the Hellenistic world is not like today's Southern Europe and Near East. This was something very complicated in there. Naturally, there were also some ethnic changes. But when you look at it from the perspective of the fact that, however, Rome still stemmed, in fact, from Western Europe, the Carolingian Empire was in part following that. Especially in the Imperial legacy, we've seen it many times. So you can compare these. And actually, the Carolingian Empire went even beyond certain in the Roman Empire in continental Europe in terms of expansion. The Carolingians conquered Germany, which the Romans had fundamentally given up as an option. Naturally, the circumstances were kind of different, but it wasn't that easy fundamentally to incorporate the whole Germany like the Carolingians did. The Carolingians conquered Saxony fundamentally. Large parts actually of southern and western Germany were already Frankish, or at least they had been Frankicized. I don't know how to say this, but the Merovingians started the colonization of Germany back in the day, since the 6th century, and after all, the Franks came from Germany themselves. So there is also this cultural affinity that obviously you can scope. But this is particularly evident. I mean, the idea of the invasions that at a certain point arrive to make all this crumble do not appear out of nothing. Take piracy in the Roman Empire. That is comparable eventually with part of what happened also with the Carolingians, with the Vikings chiefly, but also with the Saracens. Well, you had piracy that had been defeated by the Romans literally in the Mediterranean since the 1st century BC. So you have, first with Pompey, then with Caesar, you have Mediterranean piracy that is wiped out. Now, can we think it was literally wiped out? Well, of course not. There were always, brigands and pirates still kind of existed out there in the empire, but there were never those, substantial threats posed by systemic piracy that had a structure, had a consistent amount, even of naval power, like in case of the Cilician pirates, for instance. Their havens that they launched, that they terrorized the whole eastern Mediterranean and beyond. You don't find it anymore. The Romans were brutally efficient. They kind of literally physically annihilated this presence. And guess what? For fundamentally 3 or 4 centuries, piracy in the Roman Empire is never mentioned anymore. All of a sudden, during the crisis of the 3rd century, guess who starts reappearing in the Mediterranean? Piracy, pirates. And interestingly enough, this is not just properly Mediterranean piracy. I mean, in the 3rd century, you start finding even things like Frankish piracy. Now, this is kind of ironic because it's as if, the Franks in this sense were experiencing same thing they had been doing to the Romans back in the day, in part, in very different ways, naturally, compared to what the Vikings were eventually started doing since the fundamentally they started in the late 8th, but they began to hit the artists from the same reign of Charlemagne, like around 811, but chiefly during the 9th century and beyond the 10th century. There were certain, even when the Western Franks settled Rollo in the lower Seine Valley, there were certain Normans that were still, a usual threat to certain other areas of the Western Frankish kingdom up to, I think, like the 20s of the 11th century. So this was a very progressive process. But this is interesting. First of all, it shows you that in the case of the Franks during the Roman Empire, what you have is fundamentally a Germanic people that also was not particularly was not particularly acquainted with seamanship, with maritime expansion and so on, because the Germans, they kind of course, went by sea. We know that there were trade, there was very intense trade from the in Roman times, from the upper Rhine Valley up to the coasts of Norway, up to places like Trondheim and all that and so on. in the Baltic. Romans did the same. So of course, the Germans knew, the ships and used it, and that's also what part of the Germanic migration from Scandinavia also happened, like crossing the Baltic Sea and so on. So there's nothing to be surprised by. If it wasn't for the fact that it makes a lot of difference to whether it remain just in this northern European sphere, where essentially probably also make war with ships on the coastal areas, raid and so on. I don't think we have much evidence of this, at least for ancient times, if not archaeologically speaking, but it's pretty obvious. As long as you have ships, you go around making mess. Just think about peoples like the Belgians that were also pretty akin to the Germans, despite being Celt of origin, but being mixed eventually, ethnically speaking, that seized Britain, because that's what it happened. The Britons that were were fundamentally Belgians that had landed in Britain, had settled in there over the centuries and so on. So this makes you understand it was a dynamism, but there hadn't been piracy on a large scale. I mean, finding Frankish piracy in the Mediterranean actually never deepened the topic, but I think the Franks in there were not crossing like by land and eventually boarding on on the Black Sea or something. I think they actually they passed all over the either they went through the rivers like the Danube, etc. But I think mostly they circumnavigated Europe at that point. They passed Gibraltar Strait and went into the Mediterranean. I think that's how it happened. So that's very meaningful, because you have literally 300, 400 years in which such things have never happened, never. And it's not that the Germans had stopped going by sea, or any other people in Europe and in the Mediterranean that dwelled on the sea shores, for that matter. But massive political and military crisis in the 3rd century. What you have is piracy popping out. Magically? No, of course not. These were just human beings that, as long as they find a viable opportunity, they seize it, as history teaches us in its brilliantly in its drama, let's say. And this is what starts happening in some ways. And obviously piracy goes on and on. Just think about same with the Arabs. This is another parallel that you can draw with the Byzantine Empire. This is valid also for things that happen by on land, but by sea is kind of more catching, because of course by sea you can travel very far. So you might say, what were doing Frankish pirates in the 3rd century in places like the Black Sea or the Aegean or something? But well, that's what they did. Same with the Arabs. The Arabs, there's massive clash, as we know, between the deadly clash between the Byzantine and Sassanid Empire. The Byzantines annihilate the Sassanid forces at Nineveh, famously 627, if I'm not wrong, AD. But both empires are exhausted. So basically the Byzantines, of course, by the way, it seems that they also mismanaged things on land, because they had various options to stop the Islamic advance at several times. Even just the most evident battle is the one of the Yarmouk, where the same sources say that basically the Byzantine lost because they were just quarreling with each other, not because they lacked substantial power, but it would have been enough to defeat the Arabs somewhere else in Palestine, and Islam might have remained fundamentally just a minority creed or something. But what do you have is what the Arabs do. The Arabs had literally been dwelling just in the desert. I mean, the one of Muhammad, properly, because places like Yemen, etc. They had kind of a massive civilization. The Muslims that swept into the 7th century Near East were fundamentally Seminole tribesmen from the plateau, the northwest of the center-west Arabia. That's what they were. They hadn't kind of I don't know whether actually never ever seen the sea, but you can imagine what it stemmed from. In a few generations, they already know how to man ships from the also thanks actually to the help of the Egyptian and Palestinian and Syrian personnel, the shipyards, and all the ships that still existed evidently there. This happened in part also with the Germans during the Roman Empire. When the Longobards seize Italy, for instance, just an example is they conquer Pisa, and they find there, Pisa was on the sea at the time, they find in there still Byzantine dromons that are in the port, and they seize it. They go around the Mediterranean making acts of piracy. They go pillaging Sardinia and stuff like that. So it's normal. This is a great example because in our modern mindset we think that we need a manual or we need a pre-grass condition to start doing certain things. Well, history teaches us continuously that humans just adapt in an incredibly quick time, and that they dramatically underestimate their own capabilities at all times and their ability of change. This is a study. It's the if you Google, I think it was something on TED Talks about the end of history theory. It's not just the Fukuyama thing. It's broader. It's like the fact that how humans think they can change, they can adapt, and well, this is what history shows us brilliantly. That of course these pirates were never as quite foreigner as we think. This is also another, or more years, etc. This is also another very important thing to bear in mind, that when you look at even at the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, you see that first of all, leaving aside now, we will see that this fundamentally same Carolingian society that tore itself apart from the within. But secondly, even when you think about, I don't know, the Vikings, and you see that they weren't just these foreigners, fundamentally Scandinavians or Danish, etc., that set foot, in France for the first time. There were actually local Franks that were supporting them because they were training with them, because they were exploiting that opportunity to seize control of certain surrounding areas of the neighbor count that they didn't want to do. Especially the Frankish aristocracy was kind of fine. I mean, as long as they were not invested by their own, in their own turn by these raids, were kind of fine with that, because the more chaos there was in the Western Frankish kingdom, and the more they could fundamentally, the freer they were from central authority. In fact, there is this thing that is actually pretty famous as a theory, and it's evident also through certain documents that actually stress this, that the fact that the Viking raids in Western Francia, now today we will mostly exemplify Western Francia and maybe something about Carolingian Italy as well, but that's where we're going to stick at, is that fundamentally the Western Frankish monarchy was in a certain sense, I mean in relative terms to, at least to, in its relation with the nobility, it was strengthened actually by the Viking invasions. How? Well, of course the country went disrupted, so of course it was not a very happy thing to deal with. But in this moment of pure chaos, where especially here there were local communities that were still partly functional. We will discuss this later. That had been entrusted fundamentally to this provincial nobility of counts that were the fundamentally the base. We can't even call them functionaries, but fundamentally were the administrators of the Frankish world. They were mostly political, but mostly military figures, unlike other areas of Europe in which the Frankish society was very warlike in its essentials. So that there wasn't much of civil functions, even though they still existed. But the local communities started saying, okay, you know what, these local, while the Vikings were aggressing and pillaging and destroying, our local aristocracy doesn't function anymore. So we have to appeal directly to the king. And this was naturally played very cleverly from a also political point of view, because it was just saying, we don't want this local noble here to oppress us fundamentally, but we want, during this mess that is going on, but we want, if we really can't rely on anyone else, let's ask the king that at the same time was still kind of a powerful lord on his own. This was played naturally in. I'm simplifying. Excuse me. I take my shirt once again off because it's too hot in here. Sorry, but I hate heat, and therefore I hate summer. Even though I was born in summer, that I kind of love. But what I was saying is that I'm actually obviously simplifying because there were much greater political interactions that we will have. We have already discussed on Schwerpunkt actually, but we will deepen in the future. For instance, in this situation, an incredibly important role was played by the local bishops, especially in the cities that were naturally being looked upon with cupidity by people like the Vikings and so on. Just that they wanted to raise and to conquer, etc. They came to besiege Paris fundamentally as well. So and the bishops at that point were kind of building their own lordship locally. I mean, in the Frankish world, this in Gaul in general, this had always existed, kind of since late Roman times. I mean, the fact that the bishop had this enormous power for which he was kind of a lord in his own regard. But now the thing was being reinforced. So from the lay aristocracy, this brought eventually, in that case, the Western Frankish kingdom to grow very fragmented. We haven't dealt with that very much, actually, even especially in its consequences. I will have to make a video on early 11th century France to explain how the whole thing really was in terms of political balance within the kingdom. But the bishops at that point were also, in fact, worried about the lay expansion of the local counts. And what they were trying to do now was, in fact, to create a direct connection between themselves and the king, fundamentally maintaining these natural relations through which the king could have a kind of an effective power, because that's what the Carolingian Empire had. That's how things had turned. Like, I mean, if there hadn't been, for instance, no church, or at least a much less structured church than the one that the Carolingians, in fact, had started to create, especially towards the 9th century. The lay comital aristocracy would have simply said, okay, you know what, screw this, we may still think there is a king, but we act completely as if he wasn't there. We simply take over and fragment Francia into just a series of small lordships. Well, this is partly what happened, in fact, during in post-Carolingian times, but the important thing is that there was still a monarchy that was backed by the church, that still maintained an institutional profile, some sort of legitimacy of authority, of political influence, also thanks to the fact that aside from the lay aristocracy, there were other communities, chiefly the rest of the freemen, that now were kind of losing part of their traditional freedom, in fact, but also and especially the church that said, okay, let's however still look at the king in this moment of despair, of terrible devastations and things like this, so that there can still be someone who can spare us. Actually, not much even from the same foreign invasions, but also and especially from the marauderie, let's say, of the local noblemen. I made a video in which I discussed this because this is often overlooked. The video is the Pistre Capitulary 864 and spontaneous castles in western Francia. It deals exactly with here. This is a capitulary of Charles the Bald that is dealing with fundamentally with the Viking threat, but at the same time he's seemingly also very concerned, and rightfully, and not seemingly, I mean we know that it went that way, of the phenomenon of castellation that is being born not actually to defend themselves from the Vikings, but not only, but chiefly, and I mean, let's say not mostly, but it's simply carried out by the local aristocracy to form a lordship on its own and to start doing whatever the hell they like. Because at the time, even if you had a stinky moat with a ditch and stuff like that, you basically you had a hell of a defense, especially if you have several of them, and even a royal army could have, had to spend considerable resources and public resources, by the way, to fundamentally seize, or private, but in this case also weakening, in fact, the same royal assets, to storm, to take. Just imagine this in what is today's France, fundamentally, with the general, wealth of resources that these counts could seize. All the hundreds, were not thousands actually, of castles were built all over the kingdom, and this tells you perfectly how eventually the Carolingian Empire split. Now, we can't make now a history of why the Carolingian Empire fell, but it's pretty evident in the essentials that also in here, a bit like the Roman Empire, seized the moment of expansion, the one in which you could seize fundamentally taking from foreign lands and occupying them and making slaves and selling them and so on. When the borders are overstretched, so even you can't cope with that strategically in an efficient way anymore, what does happen? You start eating each other alive, fundamentally, and this is what the Carolingian aristocracy does. I mean, the most violent wars that the Carolingians ever undertook were actually the ones against each other. Think about the Battle of Fontenoy. I think it was the largest battle in Carolingian history, and that was fought, in fact, between the same members of the Carolingian dynasty, with with the participation of basically all Central European nobility, as far as we know. So that's the idea. It's that the Frankish social fabric was tearing itself apart by itself. So that's here when the other peoples that now were, looking at the thing, because they were always looking at the thing, even if we don't know about it, because they didn't write, or generally speaking, we lack the sources, etc. Europe now was interconnected. Like, you can't think of there is this silly idea that, that the Middle Ages was a place where everybody thought about its little garden, its little castle, and they didn't care about the rest, where everyone was isolated, where people didn't know things. But this is completely false. I mean, as long as I've been seeing, you can't understand basically 95% of the political and military events of medieval history, just like in any other kind of history that we know at that level. If you don't accept fundamentally that these the major political entities put it like you wish. Of course, peasants weren't that informed in general, but the whole society, the society as a whole, these political entities knew constantly what the hell was happening literally everywhere, at least in the range of some 1,000 kilometers or even. That's really how the thing was. Of course, then there were less scientific ways of assessing certain realities and so on, but if you look at the political and military logics that take place at this time, you realize a degree of progressivity, of course, but they're always kind of answering that logic. I mean, it's like with the Vikings, that the Vikings have these stages of approach towards the lands like England, like France. They start fundamentally with this small raids, because they go scoping fundamentally what the hell was going on. First, they're kind of small raids with a limited aim. They could be shooed off because the Carolingian military part still also functioned. So also this myth now that the Franks were kind of hopeless in front of these invasions is false. As a matter of fact, I'm a great fan of the idea that in places like, especially in but in general, I mean, in all post-Carolingian Europe, actually the defensive structures kind of, I mean, albeit with some degree of, and it also depends on which time you're talking about it, but they kind of function, they kind of coped with the threat at the end of the day. Like in Western Francia, building bridges over the Seine was a pretty big problem. I mean, if you were a Viking, if you had a fleet, if you were a Scandinavian pirate, you wanted to go through the Seine, you start finding this fortified bridges all over. It's a freaking problem, because you have to disembark, you have to fight them, you have to, and you lose time. You're fundamentally spotted. Reinforcements can come against you, fundamentally, from the Carolingians, the local Frankish war. So there were certain, solutions that kind of worked. And also in here, you have to understand why, fundamentally, why wasn't there that solution in certain cases, and why, the answer is mostly political. It's not even military. This is the trick that I've tried also to explain to von Clausewitz, that fundamentally, when you see certain things happening, militarily speaking, it's always because there is politics behind it that makes them going that way, because that's what real war really is. It's like in Italy, for instance. In Italy, you have these Saracens that settled in the mouth of the Garigliano River, and they stopped there and start launching raids into Rome. They sacked the I don't remember if those were from the Garigliano mouth, but St. Peter and St. Paul the cathedrals get pillaged. They get even into the Apennine. It's kind of a problem. At a certain point, at the beginning of the 10th century, if I'm not wrong, this base gets wiped out, because guess why? Finally, all the kind of Italian powers, geographically made, get themselves together, and they manage. The Pope, the Byzantines, the King of Italy, all the various dukes, certain maritime republics, they put themselves together, and they literally wipe out from the face of this place the Saracen presence, which doesn't reappear anymore. Why there? Because there was a political agreement, fundamentally. There was a political machine that, in that case, kind of also worked. Also, like the presence of the Saracens in places like southern France, that actually lasted a very long time. It's not because the Saracens were this terrible, massive, rooted, and strong presence at all. It's simply because the local Provençal nobility was kind of fine that were Saracens there instead, that were messing up the situation, kind of overall weakening the central power from the north, because guess what? They wanted to remain autonomous. They were better off with the Saracens, training with them, if they were not in their way, than making something else. And also in there, the base is fundamentally declines, because when the Umayyads from Spain start, they usually had backed it, and eventually, for some political reasons, also the relations with the Ottonians, etc., they start supporting it, and it fades away, and eventually that's when local provincial counts fractionate them out. So this is the real point. It's not really the aggressiveness of these elements, because let's be completely honest about it. We were talking about the Vikings before, that now the Saracens and the Hungars, but these were fundamentally mountaineers. They were fundamentally pirates. They were nothing like kind of professional, well-organized armies. And of course, it was rare at the time in Europe in the first place. Just at that point, the Caliphate of Cordoba, or the Byzantine Empire, had something like a centralized state with a professional permanent army, something that, however, was much more similar to what we can imagine, to also what the Carolingian military was formed, as a certain degree of privatization still existed even in those states. The Frankish war was completely private in this sense. But just for saying that, we're not talking about massive threats that appear just because they were kind of powerful on their own. It's simply because there is a political opportunity that arises, and that makes it possible. Then many of you will say, many Viking fans will say, oh well, but what about the Viking great army that ravaged constantly? Yeah, of course. I'm not saying that. Also, what especially the Vikings managed to achieve in terms of logistical terms, strategical terms, it's amazing. Like these were fundamentally just what Scandinavian society was like. These guys were able to mount up freaking a lot, an amazing expeditions with hundreds of ships, all well coordinated, which tells you what we were saying before. That doesn't matter how more or less developed you are socially speaking, but humans are able to do certain things that are pretty astonishing. I made a video, if you are interested, about the Viking ship levy. That is something we will also deal more in detail with in another time. I make the video on the Leidang. That was kind of interesting. Yeah, the Leidang conscription, 11th, 13th century. If you are interested, I finally created a Viking era playlist, which is kind of. I didn't talk about Vikings much on Schwerpunkt because I believe that there are also other things, but that's a hell of a fascinating topic. You realize, in fact, in this progressivity, that Vikings start fundamentally making these local raids. They get paid to go away, and then they realize that this cow is can be cropped, can be milked pretty well, because France, in spite of all the we're in early medieval times. There is not that there was honey, dripping from trees, and everybody was fat and stuff like that. It was a still pretty primitive and meager world, but France was one of the possibly one of the most fertile lands in definitely Europe, and there was a lot of wealth that definitely for Scandinavian standards was also kind of a luxurious by some certain standards. So they start doing increasing the size of their expeditions. They start not just making this kind of blitzes, but they start spending time actually in France. They even spend the winter in there. They stay for several years. They wander around, they raid and pillage because they don't meet any resistance. That's how also the Viking entrepreneuriality was fed, fundamentally, by the fact that that was a consistent opportunity, because they were finding a right path to go. This would have not been possible at the times of Charlemagne. Times of Charlemagne, you can have piracy that hits just the coasts, but you don't have much more opportunities. In fact, same Charlemagne created, incidentally, 2 fleets, one in France, one in what would become the Flanders, essentially. And to cope with the Viking threat, now especially that seemingly, that among the reasons that are normally, because we don't really even know what was the major factor that brought the Vikings to expand. Let's be honest. We can all make the list of of causes that intervened. In that case, normally it's said that since the Franks had conquered the Frisians, that had been normally the major pirates around from their bases in what would be today's the Netherlands, these scattered islands were also difficult to aggress by land, so that these pirate nests had kind of an easy life. And eventually these people was curbed by the Carolingians. So fundamentally the gap that was left empty, the vacuum was left empty by the the Frisians, was filled with by the Danes, or partly the Norwegians, and so that they became the next door enemy. Also considering this sense that also the distance. Now there were also other issues. Normally it's said that the Danes also feared the Carolingian conquest, which is true, because objectively, especially when the Carolingians conquered Saxony, and more generally also the post-Carolingian governments of Saxony, etc., were always kind of a looming threat over the Danes, for which at a certain point in the 10th century they decided to Christianize themselves, which also what the Poles did, what other peoples surrounding this Carolingian Germany started doing, because they feared fundamentally to be the next to be conquered. So if they were Christian, they at least had this extra factor that could prevent these Carolingian descendants, not really in that case of the Teutonians, but say, the continuators of Carolingian rule, there to desist from attacking a fellow Christian. So just for saying that, the Viking Great Army was a hell of a thing indeed, but it could happen because the local situation in France, in England, was the one that it was, with some powers that could, with great difficulty cope with this problem. In England, by the way, this had a kind of a gluing factor. Like I think the proper English kingdom is born because of the methods hostilities posed by the Vikings. In fact, with the settlement in the Danelaw and so on, with these relations, that was an important factor. France was the other way around. France was going to fragment itself even more. Always, however, with a certain form of organization that, because an authority, formally speaking, still existed. So today I actually was undecided whether to discuss in detail about the Viking raids into France, because that's something we have to do at one point. But I preferred not, because I wanted to give this broader introduction on what the problem is really, and so I hope that this video will be useful as an introduction eventually to those other topics, because we will see, France obviously was mostly hit by the Vikings, but there is also the situation of Italy was also quite interesting, and in part more varied. What is the one of Germany as well, especially during the 10th century with the Hungars, is amazing. You can't argue that. Tendentially, the main problems, for France were the Vikings, for Germany were the Hungars, and for Italy were the Saracens. But this is also approximated, because actually all these three kingdoms that actually made up the post-Carolingian, they had made up the Carolingian Empire, suffered all the three peoples. Yes, the Saracens arrived even in Germany, through the Alps, into the Rhine Valley, from the base of Fraxinatum. So all of these three countries were hit by all three the raids at once, with just this kind of balance shift for evident geographical reasons. France is closer to the North Sea, Italy is closer to North Africa, Germany is closer to Hungary. So that's what they but they suffered of all the same problems. Even the Hungars hit pretty hard into northern central Italy, into France, etc. So this also gives you, which is very fascinating, the dimension. The Vikings hit even Italy, interestingly enough. As far as I know, Germany was a bit well, at least for several reasons, they had less problems in the north with the Vikings than France. So this gives you and there are certain reasons, probably the fact that first of all, the German aristocracies remained kind of more effective and warlike. Secondly, also there is this fact to consider that Germany wasn't that rich at that time, so even the Vikings were less interested in it. And third, that also there was this kind of sort of commonality for which, in part, now the Saxony, even though being formally under a post-Carolingian government, was that continued the Frankish legacy, was kind of similar to peoples like the Danes. Not that they were at peace with each other. Actually, they fought pretty intensely. At least Viking raids were kind of more contained. Then there were also other forms of piracy. There were also the Pomeranians in what would be today's northern Poland, that also are kind of overlooked protagonists of the so-called Viking era. But I don't remember where I was going with this, but yeah, the idea is that we have to give an overall picture and to explain why this society actually, not only why it crumbled, but also why especially it had problems to cope with this threat. Yeah, and the point I was making is that, especially in the case of the Hungars, that really, literally, the Hungars started from Hungary. They arrived to pillage even into the north of Spain. I mean, they went all across. This gives you a mostly evident datum that is fundamentally that these guys were completely self-sufficient from a logistical point of view, which means that they literally fed their armies off with the local looting the local lands. I mean the lands they crossed, which you can do, especially these were also kind of relatively small armies sometimes. You know that essentially a small army can, there is a balance for which you can even do without actually a logistical chain of supplies, and just to supply, locally speaking, through foraging and etc. So this is the case. You know, the Hungars went through literally the whole Carolingian, post-Carolingian Europe, from Hungary to Spain, and made it back. This is because there was no resistance in the middle. I mean, in the middle, that's the point. Also, the Avars back in the day had launched raids into Merovingian Germany, for instance. They, you know, in there, in fact, they were coped by, you know, they were kind of halted by kings like Dagobert and stuff like that, because they arrived like in the west, where there was a more consistent power. Also, the Longobards in Friuli had kind of stopped the Avars in that point. So you realize that wherever there was a kind of a solid government, you don't even need to actually fight them off. They will actually go another way. Well, the state of post-Carolingian Europe was such for which these guys could go unopposed wherever they liked. I mean, the Vikings actually sailed up the Loire river up to Clermont. Clermont is in the heart of France, in continental Europe. It's basically the Massif Central. These guys went all the way up and back. So that gives you a dimension that they basically, of course, they were risking in part, because risk is always there, but they could do it. They could really do it. However, because there was no political entity in the middle that could put up enough resistance. Sometimes you have to think that this, first of all, the Carolingians during their civil wars actually launched literally Viking raids one against the others. They literally did that. I mean, among brothers. This was normal in Frankish society. I mean, the idea that dynasts were kind of all the sons of they were all brothers fundamentally, and every generation they fought against each other because their father's legacy was inheritance was split in equal measure. They literally launched Viking raids one against the others. So that gives you a perfect example of what the situation was like. But another thing, and this kept happening on a smaller scale, as we were saying before, you know, there were certain Carolingian counts that said, okay, I don't want to mess up with these guys, because these Vikings look kind of, you know, not very recommendable people. What I'll do, if I don't have any immediate, you know, need to stop them, because they're going hit some other places, not my own lands, I will actually make them pass. And you know what? Along the way, if they want to trade with me, it's fine. And this is it. That's what you see also in places like everywhere. You have to think that piracy here is led primarily by economical reasons. It's not that the Vikings were, you know, bloodthirsty, you know, monsters that just wanted to destroy. You know, do you think that they were they destroyed monasteries because they were Christian? They didn't give a damn. They could have been anyone's. As long as the fact that the monastery was extremely wealthy, they could make a freaking great loot. And what do you find literally everywhere? Also with the Saracens, I don't know with the Hungars, but because the Hungars were more in fact were an only terrestrial power, while the Vikings and the Saracens were kind of amphibious, let's call it them that way, powers. But what you find literally everywhere is that these pirates traded extensively with others. I made a video recently about the Saracens that was, if you give me, I give you the title once again, that deals with this, especially with the relation with the Italian powers in that, yeah, they were at war, but most of the times actually they weren't, and they simply traded. That video is called Rereading the Saracens, Slavery, Piracy and Trade in Mediterranean 7th, 11th century. That gives you, for that specific context, Mediterranean, Southern European context, the idea of what it was kind of like. Naturally, there was Christian piracy at this time as well. That's what. But what I was saying is that with piracy, you find that these guys, Vikings, Saracens, constantly traded with the peoples that they were raiding. I mean, if you take Ireland, for instance, the so-called, in fact, after by the 11th century, you for Ireland, you talk about a Hiberno-Norse society, not just because the Vikings had actually entrenched in places like even Dublin, that from the Viking entrenched camps also were developed some of the most excuse me, in one of the most important centers of Ireland. But you find, in fact, even in the Irish military equipment, for instance, Norse weapons. But it's obvious. And this happened literally everywhere, because that's what war does. War is possibly the most powerful cultural hybridator, as well as its potentially greater cultural destructor that ever exists. So the intersections exist, and now it's obvious that our historiography in the West for centuries had to stress, that these were pagans, they were enemies of the faith, that they destroyed monasteries, that they raped and pillaged and so on. But, first of all, you can find literally, even in Carolingian capitularies, and if you want I give you the sources, because I studied them at university, that actually state for the same Carolingian Christian armies that while they were marching in friendly territory, by the way, going to war, when Lent was approaching, if it was possible not to rape and not to burn churches, and these were Christian armies. So that is kind of a it's not a mystery for anyone. Armies do the same exact thing everywhere they go at all times, especially in those times. There is an impressive homogeneity in this sense. Secondly, and this is what is often overlooked, is that part of these pirates were actually Christian themselves. Let's take the Vikings. In the Viking world, there were actually Christians. A few people realize. I made a video recently that was about that didn't deal actually with the Viking expeditions, but it was like about it was most a kind of a history of religion videos. That is called Christian Faith and Germanic Rite, the religious syncretism of the North, in which I explain fundamentally how, in reality, in a completely different way that is believed today by people, because people are ignorant on average, that monotheistic faith was perfectly compatible with the pagan religion at the same time. And there are Nordic sagas that, in fact, in that case, with Helgi, if I'm not wrong, actually states no, it's not with Helgi. It's the one of the so-called atheist Viking. Now I don't remember if I found here the description. Let me see. With the saga of oh yeah, it was Helgi or Helgi, I don't know, in the Landnama book. No, sorry. The case of Helgi was the one of seizing the Landnama book of the Iceland, but there is Hrafnkel, if I pronounce it correctly, this kind of atheistic warrior that at a certain point, completely by itself, not even being Christianized by a missionary or something, abandons rejects fully and spontaneously Germanic ritualism because he got basically disappointed by it for his very serious things that happened to him, and he embraces Christianity, but not in a peaceful model, but with a chieftain kind of warrior model, for which he even felt himself to be a superior warrior because he was a Christian and not a pagan. Secondly, in fact, most of the dreaded, evangelization of Europe actually happened in a very spontaneous way. People today are, I think, there is a kind of a religious clash in going on in our minds mostly, that for which every kind of religious change in history has to be seen as, the violent conversion. Violent conversion is something actually very rare that happens, historically speaking. It does happen. There are people who die, there are people who get butchered down, there are people who get burned. It does happen, but most of the time it doesn't happen like that. It happens primarily from a cultural point of view. Was Scandinavia actually invaded by a foreign Christian army that enslaved and Christianized everyone? It didn't happen like that. Of course, local authorities sometimes enforced, but also in here they were kind of pretty limited in this. I mean, Scandinavian kings didn't even control their territory. Let's be honest about it. They took ages before they finally built something similar, comparable in terms of political solidity to the Western models. How do you think that Christianity spread in the way? With swords? It didn't quite happen that way. Secondly, we've seen also the same Franks that sometimes joined, or the same English, sometimes the same Anglo-Saxons that joined these raids. Because guess what? In every single war in history, there is always some kind of disinherited, emarginated individual, peasant, thief, martyr, whatever, just someone who wants to make money, who goes along armies to with a bag to fill with loot, and this happens all the time. The same goes for the Saracens. With the Saracens, it was like that. A few people acknowledged that there was a minority of Saracens. It was not even just like a small minority. There were actually Christians. Or Jews. This is witnessed actually by many Saracens were also coming from places like Christianized Italy or Christianized Spain. We have evidence of this. There was piracy always from the other side. There was even during the Saracen period, there was actually a Byzantine piracy. And sometimes from the sources we don't even know, because they were all kind of mixed up. Like when you have to loot and pray, nobody cares what religion you are. You just want to loot and pray. That's really it. And people, I believe that now I throw these kind of provocations out because these are not my opinions. These are things that actually are stated by sources. But I know that there will be at some point someone will, I don't care where I get these likes and so on, but there are people who today really have a serious ideological obstacle to process these things. I discovered recently many people believe that the middle, that need to, like the Middle Ages, and need to interpret them as if Europe was a place where everybody was nice and pure because of certain identitary reasons. Doesn't matter whether they're kind of proto-national, ethnical, and therefore proto-racist or religious. I don't care, but I don't know actually, but I can guess. And they have to think that Europe was kind of fine, and all these terrible peoples, the Vikings, the Hungars, the Saracens, went hitting this pure, immaculated people who never did anything. Not to them, because we don't feel it's stupid to reason in that way, but that's the point, is that a very few, it's like with encapsulation. There is this myth that encapsulation is being caused essentially by the second invasions. Of course, there were places in Europe where encapsulation was kind of accelerated and enforced by these emergential natures and situations of invasion, etc. But kind of all the studies I know, I mean, academically accepted, publicly, without any ideologism, cited with thousands of citations, some of the best academic stuff you can find around, they tell you that encapsulation was born. I mean, this is a macro historiographical evidence and knowledge that today, that encapsulation was born because of the fragmentation of Carolingian society, because of the active and wanted political aim of the local counts in post-Carolingian Europe to build a lordship on their own. And most of the warfare that was going on at this time actually was going on, also because of these invasions. Of course, nobody wants to deny them. Nobody wants to deny their importance, their destructiveness, the people who have been slaughtered, massacred for no reason, because these guys were... I don't like the Second Invaders. I'm not particularly pro-Viking, pro-Saracen, pro-Hungars. I don't care. I like kind of civilization. I like better the post-Carolingian kingdoms. Are kind of much more interesting political and institutional realities to analyze that, I don't know, the Vikings, and that's one of the reasons why I even don't talk much about them, in spite I like them as well, historically speaking. But, violence was all around. Violence was all around. We're talking about the 9th century, the 10th century. How do you think life was at that time? You find, in fact, in that video I mentioned you before, the Charles the Bald's capitularies are saying, okay, these guys are freaking building their own castles on their own. And this happens literally everywhere. I mean, I'm sure those guys might have built their own castles for the sake of defending themselves, but most of the times you realize, even given the amount of raids and where they hit, that these castles were being created literally everywhere. I mean, even in the same core of Europe, the one that has been least affected by the second invasions, were mostly something coming from the borders, from external, you find castles there all around. In Italy, there is a beautiful Tuber study that shows that the area around Rome actually starts encapsulation only after that the Saracens had been wiped out, because before it was too complicated it was too risky to go out there to build things. It was better to be entrenched already where they were. It's only after the Saracens are going away, economy starts spinning once again, that this noble Roman lords started building their own castles in a very conscious and aware and very, let's say, targeting mission to overrule the countryside through castles and defending their estates and expanding them, stuff like that. And so ideologism sometimes once is said that no, this never happened. The Europeans back were such saints that just suffered the attacks of these people, and you can't. I mean, I believe that many of you who will listen to this will be already also from that side. But just take to read some source to understand what the situation was. And reading sources doesn't mean to find, like those people usually do, is that like there are people who say, on the contrary, for instance, want to defend the Vikings and say, well, there's actually no source in which the Vikings are witness to have raped, because there are some sort of kind of suprematist groups, racial supremacists, who had to say that the Vikings were kind of pure people who were just grotesquely depicted by those terrible and perverted Christian monks that wrote that were monsters and so on. At the time, writing that your enemy was a monster was the average literally everywhere, first. Secondly, how do you think, I don't know, Irish female genoma was brought to Iceland during the Viking era? That a Viking knocked gently at the door of a tender Irish maiden and said, "Do you want to marry me? Come to me to Iceland." Well, guess what? Those were freaking stolen, as kidnapped as slaves, raped, abused, and brought there just to make children. And I'm not saying that, there wasn't maybe, I'm sure there has also an Irish girl who's been falling in love with a beautiful-looking Danish, Norwegian Viking. But, something tells me that it's kind of a minority of the evidences. And by the way, all we know, both historically and archaeologically speaking, tells us that that was a freaking violent, rude, and merciless world. And that's what we are as humans. And that's something that I also try to express now with the von Clausewitz series. People who say that war is inhuman are people who don't understand much about anthropology, who don't understand much about what human is. Because we need to demonize something to feel ourselves better. And this means to responsabilize ourselves. Because if you don't acknowledge who you are, what you can do by biological structure, it's not that you can't change it. Of course, we have a reason. We can discipline ourselves and so on, but we're still these fucking stupid apes that respond to their instincts and you know, do weird stuff, and that's what we are. And the sources are clear because, by the way, sources, and this is also very important to stress, never tell you, I mean, if you reconstruct them properly and historically, they tell you, yeah, that violence was used, but at the same time, it wasn't a violence that had an end to itself. This is also particularly important from an historical point of view, because one thing is saying, okay, there was one guy who freaks out and massacres other people. Yeah, that happens, sadly, all times in history. But, you know, if you look at, especially from a, you know, from a wider perspective, you always realize that these political and military actions and behaviors, I mean, I'm talking at a strategical level. So what eventually produces the battle, the expedition, the pillaging, and so on, has a sound logic. I mean, it's never done because that guy is evil. Of course, he's evil in the sense that, okay, I'm planning to go raid England with hundreds of ships from Denmark. Let's make the greatest loot we can. Yes, that's obviously those people had a very different morality from the one we have, and surely I believe that people from the other side, from continental Europe, had kind of a better, you know, civilized and actually a higher moral standards, at least closer to the ones we have now. So I kind of sympathize, telling the truth, towards them the most. But even from the Viking side in that case, that's you have to understand, for instance, what that loot served to in the process of the construction of for instance, of a local monarchy there, I don't know, in Denmark. Think about Knut the Great. You can't understand Knut the Great's expansion, political action, etc., if you don't realize what we're trying to do in Denmark there. And that's how it worked. Vikings, just for the record, were great looters, and generally speaking, all these societies that are based on raid on their economy, just do like the one of the steppes, with all the differences of the case, of course, loot, not because they're evil. Of course, their society kind of gets habituated to, gets used to that kind of violence, and kind of tries to justify it through, you know, culturally speaking, so that violence and that cruelty is felt kind of necessary, and that's why they were called kind of barbarians from the other side. But you can't understand why that culture does it if you don't realize, for instance, in that case, what loot means for them. Because in a society where, for instance, you're nomad or semi-nomad, or you don't have enough resources locally to survive, there are either two options: either you starve to death, or you go steal someone else's food. And that's essentially what the Vikings did, because what we think normally, at least the reason why Scandinavia actually started this thing, is the usual climatic thing, you know, the idea that is also a bit reductive, but fundamentally the idea that Scandinavia was poor at the time, was kind of like a third world in Europe, and they had a very few resources, because, you know, in Norway you have just the mountains in your back, you know, between you and the sea, so there are not great fertile plains, etc. Sweden is kind of marshy and humid, and it's freaking cold. Just think about what the temper meant for the technology of the time. It's not that Scandinavia was poor because the Scandinavians were dumb. On the contrary, Scandinavia was poor because it was freaking cold. And that's how, you know, in early medieval times you had to to cope with things. So what happened is that there is this alleged weather warming for which Scandinavians kind of have a higher fertility rate, or better, a higher survival rate, because children now grow into a milder weather, so they survive. But what happens is that now there is a surplus of population for which the local structures have still not able to satisfy their needs fundamentally, because they they expand slowly, and now the children are made quickly, and you don't have this have become adults now. They have to go somewhere. This was pretty much the standard, by the way, of all kind of Indo-European peoples of the origins in the tribal world, because the tribal world is normally that form of society with all the approximations. Anthropologists will kill me, of course, but that develops in a stage where fundamentally you don't have many other options. Why do you think that great civilizations were born in places like the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Yellow River? Because guess why? They had freaking more resources. The land was more fertile. The weather was milder. They had more surplus. They could build things. What about Northern Europe? Northern Europe, you had to go pillaging at some point. It was normal for these tribes to say, okay, you know what? Now you're young. You're a young warrior. I kind of maintained you up to this time. Now you go out there in the world and you win your place. And these bands of young men actually went there fighting in these brotherhoods, and the warrior brotherhoods. Sometimes they went even serving to the Roman army, but let's say just the ones that remain in Germany. They just went killing each other, because if you kill each other, you also basically wipe out a part of mouths to feed, so that is still kind of functional to the system. So you see how grim it is, but at the same time how logical it is. And that's why these peoples behaved in that way. Naturally, it's not that they were kind of gentle souls that you have to justify. You don't justify someone who comes into your house from the sea, raping and pillaging, burns your house down and massacres you. You don't have to, but at least you understand the motives why this happens. And this is the point. Before judging history morally, just kind of learn history first and try to understand why certain things happen. Then you don't have to justify them. As a person, as an individual, you can't condemn morally. But when you're a historian, the most important thing you do is to find out what happened. It's like with the judiciary. Judiciary doesn't have to have any sense of it doesn't have to be influenced by subjective judgments before knowing. Well, it seems it's today's favorite sport to judge things without knowing them, so that you have people who transform the early medieval times as the narratives of the poor Western civilization under attack by these bands of brutes that were kind of the same ones that will explode ourselves today, make us explode today with terrorist attacks. It's not like that. It's not like that. And if you want to cope with, for instance, this last thing, you can't reason like, back in the day. Of course, there are other excesses, because of course, people who condemn the Crusades, for instance, do not realize that in fact the Muslims had been invading Europe for centuries. So that's not a moral legitimization to go to the Near East and massacre everybody in Jerusalem, including Christians and Jews, because you can't even distinguish them, because you don't give a damn about religion, like always in history, including the terrorists, make them blowing up. But you at least can understand this in perspective for saying that, whoever thinks that history is a place where people were kind of nice, and you can accuse people at millennial distances just because now you have certain moral standards and you know nothing about history in the first place. But that's not how it works fundamentally, because most of the times you hear it also in political debates. It's just like picking a particular event, completely extrapolated from its historical context, and saying, well, that works because it's as if it had happened to you. And it's not like that. You can't do like that with history. You have always to contextualize, which, I repeat, doesn't mean to justify, but it means to motivate. And to motivate is important because it gives you a direction. It gives you a model interpretation that that helps you to understand many things ultimately about yourself, because we're talking about history of humans. Humans were exactly like us, from whichever side they were. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Sorry. So this was one point. Going back to I would say now looking at Carolingian society as a whole, fundamentally, as we were saying before, we will have to make a story of all the things that literally happened under this point of view, everywhere. In France, in Italy, in Germany, everywhere. In this post-Carolingian, let's say better, Carolingian, post-Carolingian world. But looking at it in general, as we were saying today as an introduction, what you see is that from at least the second decade of the 8th century, when the Saracens started to basically go across the Pyrenees into Gaul, the Franks have lived fundamentally in a sort of continuous siege that doesn't have to be exaggerated, but you know, it kind of makes sense. The 8th century was mostly, it wasn't just like this is important to remember, kind of, because it can be interpreted in many ways. Normally we remember the Franks in fact as conquerors, fundamentally, by saying, okay, these guys, when they simply decided to take over like half of Europe, and they did it. Of course, there were certain characters of Frankish society that were pushing into that direction. Also in there, you can't understand Carolingian expansion if you don't understand what was happening within Frankish politics and society. Because it wasn't, you know, what was at the frontiers wasn't the immediate problem. But at the same time, you have to think how this society processed the idea of the enemies, of the external. Under, you know, there's a long history behind. One of the most difficult things when you talk about military history is finding fundamentally a beginning of the conflict, of the hostility. The Franks had created back in between the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 6th century a pretty big and sound domain that they eventually ruined during Merovingian times, and that only the Carolingians saved from the complete disappearance, from extinction fundamentally, that had expanded over other peoples. So here there were very complex factors. There were certain peoples that, for instance, were technically under the already theoretically under the Frankish rule. We're talking about peoples like, in fact, the Aquitanians, the Alemanni, at least namely, you know, the Thuringians and so on. They kind of had belonged fundamentally to that, not really Commonwealth, because it wasn't really like that, but you know, that had been Francicized, that also created problems. Like the Aquitanians normally were the kind of the most Riotos, but there were also other peoples within this group that kind of were troubled. Also because in Carolingian times now, those peoples weren't quite the peoples of the late Roman, very early medieval times. They were now influenced by the Franks. The Carolingians, at one point, for instance, make a massive slaughter of the Alemannic nobility. This Alemannic nobility was Alemannic, even stressing its ethnic identity, because it was living into that region of Alemannia. But they were descendants of the Merovingian Frankish counts and the local nobility. So now they were just trying to seize, to carve a space within the empire, having exploited the Merovingian crisis, and the Carolingians say no, halt, and they slaughtered them. Then there was a series of enemies that was kind of just outside. I mean, it was just like at the frontiers. They were the old enemies of all times. There had been the Saxons, partly the Avars, the Longobards, they weren't really enemies, but they eventually ended up that there had been some sort of hostility, progressive hostility. Now, we discussed how the Carolingians came to conquer the Longobards. I even dedicated a whole playlist about Longobard history. It mostly revolves around this episode. These episodes, actually. Then there were these completely new peoples that obviously the Franks had heard of historically, like in fact the Arabs, the Scandinavians, the Hungars that came literally from. I mean, some came literally from nowhere, like the Hungars. The Saracens, obviously the Arabs arrived from the Islamic expansion. The Vikings were always there. And actually, it seems that not the Vikings as peoples, because these were the Scandinavians, say better. But there was a substantial interaction in the North Sea between these populations. They were actually pretty similar. After all, the Franks, especially the ones living in Austrasia, were practically indistinguishable from the Saxons by many standards. I mean, if you study their legal practice, and particularly their language, kind of pretty homogeneous, and in turn the Saxons were pretty similar to the Danes, just for saying. You can imagine also the relations that existed between the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons. So there was a sort of northern the kind of perception of most of all being of Germanic origin, because that's what also invested in this sense, especially in the international relations, the Longobards and the Visigoths before they were wiped out by the Arabs. But I mean, the idea that there was a common sense of belonging. It also naturally went beyond let's call them national frontier, or the ethnical frontier as it was perceived at the time, which is mostly a juridical one. When you read about ethnicities in this early medieval, high medieval context, is mostly like something you have on the base of law, under which law fundamentally you're judged. That makes you belong into that ethnic group, and so you have this fundamentally series of frontiers. You find an internal one in the same Frankish world, an external one on the frontiers, and plus on the borders, let's say, even if there weren't actual borders at the time. And then these external forces that arrived from somewhere else, evidently. So you can understand that Frankish society, at this point, had to be militarized, like most of our European societies, actually, at a level of pre-alert, at least. I mean, the idea that at a given point, someone could invade them. And surprise, surprise, in fact, by the beginning of the 8th century, you find this northern Iberian Islamic powers, not even the Umayyads proper, but these guys who were dwelling in northeast of Spain, that start launching raids far deep into Gaul. And they attack Aquitaine, they attack southern Gaul. At the time, it was believed that also given the poor geographical knowledge, at least compared to our own, of the time, is that the Muslims thought they could fundamentally, because the main goal was seizing Constantinople. So while attacking them from the east, from Asia, the idea was from the Muslims to go through Spain into the heart of Europe and taking Constantinople from the west. This was the kind of the myth of this kind of aim. Telling the truth, these raids that are even stopped for what concerns Aquitaine in 732 with the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers as it's often said, is they kind of come to an. They were aimed to probably, especially one of 732, was just more than just a large raiding party like it was in the normal Muslim fashion, but it probably was aimed also to to expand into France, leading to Aquitaine. And the Franks naturally were next door because across the Loire river that is close to Tours, there is Francia proper. So Charles Martel, as is widely known, is managed to crash this major expedition, which wasn't actually so threatening to the fate of Europe as it's often thought. Usually, the Battle of Poitiers is described in between two extremes. Either all Europe had to fall in the hands of the Arabs. Let me tell you, all Europe would have not fallen to the hands of the Muslims, not even if the Ottomans had won at Vienna. As many people think that, I don't know, they would have found the Turks at the mouth of the Thames River. No, it would have not happened like that. Secondly, from the other side, you find people say, oh no, just the Battle of Tours was just a small raid that Franks crashed by chance. No, it wasn't, not even like that. It was actually a big battle for the time, for time standards. It was probably leading to an expansion of, if not stopped, actually, it would have, the Muslims would have managed to take to make a bridgehead fundamentally into Gaul. This could have created further problems. This is also another problem of the strategy of the times. We've seen before also with the major second invasions of the 9th and 10th centuries, that the problem was that there was no actual physical border to stop these threats. You had necessarily to raise up an army and to go meet these guys in open ground, or at least to counter them in some way, which was difficult. In the meanwhile, these guys could sweep in and to raid and to do whatever they wanted. So this was mostly an economical problem, because the economy was, the crop rate was definitely very low at the time. If you destroyed a field, an estate, before rebuilding it, you needed a lot of resources, so you could cause considerable damage and unrest and chaos ultimately to a foe just by raiding, because basically you wipe out from his control an entire area that was wealth is based on agriculture. So it's not that the Franks literally had a control all over these territories they claimed for them, because it was kind of impossible to do it for the coercive standards of the time. But a pacified area in this sense, where agriculture worked and some surplus could be drawn, was necessary for them to seize part of their surplus, at least potentially. So also you didn't have to squeeze too much your subjects with taxes, because that could be detrimental also for the local economy, also because people would go away. How do you block in the 8th century the emigration, for instance? It's quite complicated. So what you need is that your frontier are fundamentally pacified. And that's the major threat that brings the Franks to in part expand against certain enemies. It's like with the Saxons. Why did the Carolingians actually invade Saxony? Well, the Carolingians invaded Saxony because the Saxons were like a pain in the behind, because ever since they had met, and since the 7th century, the Saxons had been launching raids into Austrasia, so into this area of today's northwestern Germany, roughly the Belgium and part of the Benelux, fundamentally, that wasn't that enormously fertile, but it was kind of still productive. It was along the Rhine Valley. There were some resources to be drawn, etc. And therefore, that area had grown, had not fully developed its economical potential, because it was constantly under attack. It had actually grown militarized. That's also where the Carolingians stemmed from, also as warriors, etc. They knew the Saxons in this sense. They were their neighbors at that point. They knew what their tactics were. So what happens is when the Carolingians annex Saxony, first of all, they managed to to occupy all of Germany. So all the Germanic populations that dwell in Central Europe are fundamentally incorporated into the Carolingian Empire. And secondly, Saxony is kind of a very poor land indeed. It's a place where that also the same Carolingians struggle a lot in order to build something consistent, and it takes generations to structure a valid power. Incidentally, it's very interesting that the empire actually was reborn from Saxony with the Ottonians, so it's kind of interesting and paradoxical that this kind of barbaric and peripheral land of the Carolingian Empire came to be the center of the same of the Renovatio Imperium. I made a playlist on the Ottonian history exactly for this reason, because I like the Ottonians in general, and so and at the same time it would form a bulwark. It was essentially shifting the border from the Rhine, from the Scheldt rivers to the Elbe, which was the frontier of the Slavs that up to that time had actually, up to the conquest of Saxony, had cooperated with the Carolingians to fight against the Saxons because they were a common neighbor. And then now instead they start clashing one against the other. So it's Saxony that becomes kind of militarized, or better, it was also tribally speaking, militarized, given that what society was. But the Rhine Valley breathes once again because it finally has, the frontier has been shifted beyond, so that those regions can kind of develop in a more consistent way. It's like this happens all times it's why certain lands that were also not very productive were kind of fortified in other empires. It's like when you see, it's not because locally there were many resources, but because they formed a kind of belt to protect more fertile areas. So the same goes with the Longobards. It was different. Also with the Avars, because in that case it was just about seizing. The Avars weren't threat anymore. The Longobards also had not invaded Gaul, so at that point, that also was a driving factor. I mean, acquiring more resources, because Italy was freaking rich. Also, the Avar Khaganate, in spite of its decline, still had an enormous amount of money. We had the sources talking about the Carolingian seizing of the great treasure, the Kagan, in we don't even know actually where. It would be today's Hungary, somewhere like there, because the exact place I don't think it's really known. But just for saying it, this was what you need: resources to maintain his empire, and you need them either making the local economy work, either seizing surplus from other areas. Now the problem is also for the Carolingians is that there are this at the end of this expansion, this outstretching, fundamentally the second invasions start. This is perhaps not a coincidence, because the germs of the Frankish the crisis of Frankish society were evidently already developing, breaking out consistently, and that's why once you are expanded, you need to contract, and this is what the Carolingians actually hold out. I mean, the Carolingians practically, this is also very important to consider, they actually never lost a region. I mean, while the empire, the Roman Empire, for instance, overstretched, and in a certain point it has to bail out from places like Mesopotamia or Dacia or other. The Carolingian lands, fundamentally, the ones that were conquered, remain in the hands of the Franks. This is also particularly meaningful because it tells you also that the Vassallatic-Beneficiary formula, with all its limits, actually molded the local society in a way that it could cope also with these problems on the longer run. There weren't parts of the empire were actually lost to the Second Invaders. Yes, okay, at a certain point the Western Franks give Normandy to the Vikings, but it was essentially their own land, and these Vikings remained They transform themselves into Franks, fundamentally, from a cultural point of view. They are vassals of the king, etc. So there is nothing like a real loss. And this is particularly meaningful. But at the same time, these lands gets militarized. They have to cope with this massive, what you can interpret as a massive siege that starts happening from the second invasions onwards. So whatever the reasons were, that fundamentally the first one was that Carolingian society was tearing itself apart by itself. In fact, this is the point. But there is a broader militarization that at a certain point, however, also because of the political fragmentation, is not able, however, to stop physically anymore these invaders that invade. But you see, they don't seize land because they realize that, locally speaking, this Frankish society kind of works as a model, but at the same time is irreversibly fragmented. It's also very private in nature. This is also perhaps the key to understand really Frankish society. Frankish society is fundamentally a private society. The Franks have an extremely low, non-existent understanding of public authority. It's something that the Carolingians, as especially their most enlightened representatives, kind of understand when they expand in places like Italy, or they enter in contact with Constantinople. They see that there is a more centralized model. Even the one of the caliphs of Cordoba, that they want to try, and of Baghdad, that they want to emulate. Because they realize that their society kind of sucks, because every count believes that he's entitled to his own land, fundamentally, and as a private possession. Because that was their Germanic mindset. There was no way to change it. And in fact, the Carolingian Empire arguably collapses also because of this lack of central institutions that, aside from the idea of the empire and kingship, fundamentally do not have, they're kind of empty. They don't have any stability. It's mostly the church that develops a lot under Carolingians, but that's also kind of the another face of the same medal, because the same ecclesiastics were the same clergy was coming from the lay nobility that had this. So that's the main reason. But there is also some other structural reason that, in fact, that will make this society only very slowly see the end of these second invasions towards the up to the 10th century and beyond, actually, because at least in France, real invasions kind of stop by the second decade of the 10th century. And that was mostly because they started to find a kind of modus vivendi with the Normans that, however, actually didn't stop for 1 century to create problems, because we said it before, that certain Normans now they were settled in northern France, but they kept behaving in very unruly fashion. But definitely the bigger problem were the Saracens and the Hungars at that point. Beyond that point, for they kept harassing the Carolingian lands up to fundamentally for the whole 10th century. So what were the causes, if you want, of these weakness in Maine? Aside from the political side that, as we've seen, was determining as a factor, was some structural reason that brought to that also added to this? Well, sure, there were certain factors that have been evidenced that, however, are kind of debatable. Not because they're necessarily wrong at all. They were all influencing. The problem is that, as it often happens in history, you really don't know in which measure they they impacted. So first, there is a macroscopical evidence, the size of the territory. I mean, of the Carolingian Empire, what was left of it. I mean, it was literally immense. It was something stretched from Catalonia to Austria, and from Denmark to southern Italy. I mean, it was literally this big, massive chunk of continental Europe that was so different. Naturally, you can imagine. Also in language, in political and administrative models. I mean, it was kind of a big problem. I mean, actually, the Carolingians worked very well towards the unifying direction. They were able to give a kind of a homogeneous model, at least from a political, social point of view, Vassallatic-Beneficiary system. Secondly, also the church, they gave an impulse to the reform of the church, the development of the church, of these also monasteries became, together with the capillary schools, massive also cultural centers of production. And also very importantly, the unification of writing that brought an end to the so-called early medieval Britain particularism, at least in continental Europe, for which fundamentally all the post-Carolingian kingdoms started to write in a similar fashion. But aside from this, it was really the nature of political and military power that couldn't make the sovereigns encompass territories that went more, that were larger at a point than a regional scale. You see them with fundamentally with the macro chunks into which the empire split. France went, the French kings went constantly declining in their power. They had a very small power just around Paris. That was one of the most dramatic situations. In Germany, you had this ancient ethnic duchies that were separated by these massive German forests. They spoke different languages. They weren't fundamentally very united. It's just at this point that, especially from these centers like Lorsch or Reichenau or St. Gallen, that some monasteries come up with this idea of the Teutonic kingdom that was allegedly a kind of a unique stuff, but a unique ensemble, but it was relatively weak. A truly German proto-national identity was yet to be born. It was maybe just beginning at that time through this thing. Italy was wasn't working really bad at the beginning as a kingdom, also because it was benefiting of the pre-existing administrative structures of the Longobards. It was actually kind of smaller. It was essentially the Po Valley in Tuscany, and the rest were the Apennine, and there were various areas of frontier, and but it kind of died out in the end. I mean, there were these kind of duchies and marches. They were all competing for being crowned in Rome by the Pope, but they never, basically by the 11th century, an Italic kingdom as a unique system couldn't exist anymore. It kind of finishes as an option. Then there is the rise of the cities, of the communes, and nothing can be done. So you realize that there is an evident lack of control, of a unique authority over this enormous space, and that even the authority that is proposed to control the power, that is delegated power, is very weak in resources, but it's usually weak because there is no political consistency. All the counts kind of rebel. They do whatever they want, and they start building their own lordships, and it just are very fluid mass through which the second invaders can really pass relatively unopposed. There is some, however, I don't want to, as we were saying before, I don't want to make it too dramatic. There is some effort to really to halt these invasions, and you can argue that all of these three areas actually succeed, because the Western Frankish kings managed, as we've seen, by the 10th century to at least incorporate the Normans into their political institutional system of the kingdom, and to keep them at bay, so at least the hardest hits are stopped. In the south of Gaul, there are the Saracens, but they fundamentally they're too far from the reach of the French king, and that's maybe the area when things remain more complicated. But generally speaking, also there was this kingdom of Burgundy that had to cope with it. But the kingdom of Burgundy is something relatively weak since the beginning, and eventually kind of collapses. At one point, actually, the kingdom of Burgundy had even more options to become a kingdom, to survive actually than the Western Frankish kingdom, but it kind of dies out eventually. So that's this history of this aborted kingdom that is often forgotten. The Eastern Frankish kingdom, that is Germany roughly, in the 10th century manages, thanks to the Saxon and Franconian cooperation, and also the forgotten one of the Bavarians, to halt the Hungarian raids, the Hungarian invasions, which is done progressively, patiently, with difficulty, but it's achieved. In Italy, this fragmented situation is fundamentally it's mostly the south of the peninsula. It was not part of the Carolingian Empire that suffers the greatest problems with the Saracens, etc. There are the Byzantines in there as well. But the main threat is the bases of the Garigliano and the Fraxinetum. Fraxinetum is actually in Provence, but they launched raids into Piedmont, and from Garigliano close to Rome, etc. But progressively, especially the ones with Rome, there is this joint effort. The Saracens are kind of wiped away. So you see that in all these three kingdoms, there is a sort of system that still kind of goes on, in spite of all. That kind of manages, in spite of the mass of private jurisdictions and all the fragmentation, the chaos, etc., to maintain I wouldn't say a unitary direction, because it would be too much, but kind of it cooperates to get rid of the problems fundamentally, which is normally what societies do when they're put under enough pressure to make it feasible. Talking in terms of weaknesses, there is also a geographical consideration to make. As we've seen, the borders didn't quite exist as such. The Carolingians didn't have a wall, for instance. Interestingly enough, the Danes, also the Anglo-Saxons with Offa's a dike, for instance, they built something similar, just now for different reasons. But in the Carolingian Empire, you don't have anything like that fundamentally, because the nature of the Carolingian Empire develops at such a great level since the beginning that it had fundamentally mostly being based, also in defense, on the ability to raise a huge amount of troops at once to cope and as a sheer deterrent fundamentally that could hold. So paradoxically, these walls are typical of smaller powers. It naturally also considered that certain areas of Carolingian Europe were already kind of fortified in some way, but by themselves, I mean, at least in the main political centers or something. But there is one major highway that is exploited by the Second Invaders, both internally and externally. That is the sea, and the rivers. So along the sea, obviously you can't stop anyone as long as you have a fleet on your own. The Carolingians weren't much of a maritime power, actually, not at all. They were mostly a land terrestrial power, but at a certain point they built certain fleets to cope, especially with the Normans. And they, in part, they even succeed, because they win at sea sometimes, even with the Vikings, against the Vikings. So proving also in here that warfare is pretty standard. You don't need to be a Viking to know how to fight on the sea, not to have a consistent maritime experience from, traditionally speaking, to transform yourself in a good sailor on a short run. But these measures still can't contain the sea from the Normans or the Saracens. The other major way were the waterways. This is especially the case of the Vikings. The Saracens do something similar, but they mostly go on land, so it's not really like that. But the Vikings, for one even a geographical reason, is that France has a freaking lot of rivers, pretty large ones. So these were perfect waterways to make the Viking fleets sail up and to pillage all into the heart of France, geographically speaking. You know that some Viking ships were fundamentally built, specialized for with a very low keel to go very close to a shore, or in fact, no, to sail, not to be stuck into the river beds. So they were kind of boats specialized into these kind of operations. Viking maritime nautical engineering was renowningly of the finest order. The Saracens were not so worse. Actually, I think we like to talk about the Viking era, but it's mostly a northern-centric perspective. If you look at what was happening in the Mediterranean, that also was an area that had a massive a millenary nautical tradition. Things were also there functioning in a very dynamic way. And I don't think that it's been studied so well like in the case of the Vikings. And it was also actually a very important part of history, especially for Southern Europe, for the world Mediterranean in general, as you can imagine. This was another evident problem. So as you have seen in France, they cope with this, at least on the sand, by building fortified bridges that naturally also needed some kind of an administration we could provide for their building, their construction, because they were expensive. So also in there, you realize it's mostly a political reason. It's not about let's build a bridge so we can stop the Vikings. Well, yeah, okay, but who does pay for building the bridge? That's the real point. There's a real problem. And that was naturally just the most evident infrastructural reaction. But naturally, even encapsulation, as we were saying before, was developed in part to cope with these problems, but chiefly, as we also recalled, for making the local lords fighting against each other. And we know that Franks joined into this mess. They went murdering around, looting, pillaging, exploiting the chaos. This always happens. It's like after earthquakes, other natural disasters, there are people who go pillaging the houses of people who have fled. Or it's always like that. There are no exceptions, unfortunately. Another factor that is also kind of interesting is looking at the endemic potential of Europe in itself. I mean, the Carolingian Empire had seen the development of these, mostly with the distribution of property. The Franks had accelerated this concentration of power, of wealth in the hands of a very few that made up the Vassallatic beneficiary elite. that would have transformed itself fundamentally into the feudal elite within some century, and this brought to an impoverishment of the population. But it had not fundamentally not altered the endemic dynamics, I believe. I believe that there was no massive. The idea of the Carolingian Renaissance is something that is, in my opinion, confined only at a cultural level, as we were saying before. From a sheer socio-economical point of view, there was no great expansion. There were definitely certain changes that were important. There was some monetary policy that was done, but it was mostly due to the fact that there were some rulers that could control more than what could be done before. It was not necessarily a growth. There was an expansion in some ways, yes, this is true. Also, geographically speaking, that is pretty limited, but at the endemic level, I don't think that Europe particularly benefited from Carolingian times. Also because of the wars, the civil wars against the Saint Franks, that kind of desolated and kind of exhausted even the local resources in part. And objectively, the population was endemically very sparse. In Central Europe especially, it's very, very evident. To this you have to add that these people were growing fearful. Because indeed, and poorly fed and defenseless fundamentally. Because just think about what the Franks had managed to do. They had kept expanding on other peoples, but had kind of lost their autonomy. The Franks had seized resources. They had structured society with that model with which, they started to draw consistent resources from their feeding their military machine. The local populations had to pay these contributions. They couldn't do much now. They were disarmed as well, because this process in general had brought to the stratification of society brought to the disarming of the freemen, the peasantry. This is important because it's a trend that will affect all the Middle Ages. The ideal of the Germanic freeman agriculture was they also participated with his weapons to the army was dead, especially also in certain. It was dead actually in certain areas that were the same hub of Frankish power. That is important to remind, because those are the region of Gaul that had grown into this kind of more Roman model, where there was the great large estate owner that owned all the means, the weapons and stuff, and all the others were just colonists, peasantry, who worked for them, were disarmed, etc. Naturally, the more Germanic areas, like especially the ones that had been just conquered by the Carolingians, like Saxony, etc., they were kind of more warlike. Indeed, in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, the freemen's model, the old levy, Germanic levy of the Herban, kept functioning for a much longer time. You find it even in times, I think, like the 12th century, so pretty late. Theoretically, it existed also in Western Francia, but also in Italy, but society now was really, that was the theory. Now the practice was transforming, and even in Germany, actually, it happened in the same way. The Carolingian conquest brought to a sensible loss in the individual's freedom. At a certain point, there is the Standing Revolt, in which the German freemen fundamentally rebel to this new social, these new political and social impositions. They even ally themselves with the serfs. That was a shame from a Germanic point of view, culturally and morally, but because now they realize that if they don't ally with with the serfs that could bring some more manpower, they would have been transformed into serfs themselves quite soon. against the nobility, and in fact instead the nobility wins at the end of the day. And so also in Germany this process is, albeit more slowly, is actually taking place. Italy was less, French society, let's call it Western Frankish better. Western Frankish society was also structured like this, but it had more aristocracy, more powerful aristocracies, because of this old stratification. In Italy wasn't like that. Italy was much more civil in nature. The Longobards freemen had kind of civilized quite soon. They had transformed not just into peasants but also into traders. Longobards society was much more juridically and administratively based than France. Was more ordered, but as a consequence, the population was already less combative, let's say. Not that combativity was lower in general as individually, but the social structures had brought the society to develop in a kind of a more pacific way, and also the aristocracies were kind of poor. So actually, the freemen were kind of well off. Italy had the highest per capita wealth in the world at this time, even at this time. So the Carolingians actually import this feudal, this Vassallatic-Beneficiary system into Italy, where also in here there is a collapse essentially of individual wealth, which remains very, very high, the highest in the world still, even in the following centuries. But also in here, society progressively is fundamentally framed to this Vassallatic-Beneficiary model of Frankish importation. And also in here, the freemen kind of are more framed into this system. They become peasants under the lord, etc. Although there are also the cities where a different world kind of develops in parallel as well. Incidentally, yesterday we were talking exactly about this. Yesterday's video. So generally speaking, the population of the Carolingian Empire and the post-Carolingian territories, kingdoms, let's say, is not organized for war as it had been used before. We're not in the very early medieval times where everybody was kind of a tribal warrior, and knew that now the system had changed, and it actually had changed for the best in terms of military development, in the sense that now the Franks had been developing this mounted elite of heavily armored warriors that could fight on horseback. They trained all their lives. They were now real professionals of war. The freemen in the tribal society, makes war, but they're kind of small raids, things like that. There is not a big deal of organization. The Carolingian Empire had a freaking amazing military machine, even in terms of logistical organization and so on. Now this elite was legitimately made up of professionals of arms, and they knew how to make real war work. Naturally, also, Carolingian society was, Carolingian cavalry was developing relatively slowly. Even in pre-Carolingian times, we can say that mounted combat had kind of increased very slowly its importance. Infantry would remain still very important in the tactical balance up to the 12th, 13th century fundamentally, but they were declining pretty steadily, and because they were being transformed from warriors into peasants that had to work for the elite, the ultra elite, that had to fight on horseback, needed armor, war horses, a lifetime of training that costed an enormous quantity of resources, and only lots of peasants working for them could provide. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So the local population has less means to defend themselves, to organize itself. It's generally scared. is suffering the most of all these Frankish civil wars, later the Second Invasions, or both things at a time. It grows worse fed. You know that there is this idea that, according to me, is a bit debatable, but for some standards it makes sense that the European freeman of the very first early Middle Ages was kind of better fed than the one of the later centuries, which is true. It's definitely true, even if life was incredibly harsh. The average early medieval ate normally more fat and proteins than his successor in the following centuries. This is because naturally the aristocracy now manages also these masses of peasants, provides for its feeding, and they naturally economize. They save on it, so they eat usually lots of carbohydrates, like bread, wheat, so something that lacks also other nutritive elements. So this population grows weaker, and it grows more dependent on the aristocracy, on the war professionals. They can't defend effectively themselves. This is also why the signories start developing in this context, why these various lords, this embryonal feudal class is forming into Europe in post-Carolingian times, because the peasantry entrusts its own defense to these individuals that get the local resources to defend the territory, and this creates the imbalance between the two classes, because the peasants grow increasingly poorer and the aristocrats become increasingly wealthier. And but this society really works in this way. So this brings as another term of another element of weakness of this system, the fact that the local freemen are naturally less warlike. They make less resistance to the invaders. Conversely, there is also a lesser number of professional warriors all around this territory. So there is also kind of a physical gap. If you find a tribe that maybe is not that organized, etc., but it's pretty warlike, it's pretty cohesive nationally, let's say, it's difficult to, they can be defeated, but it takes a lot. Just see how much it has taken for the Carolingians to take out the Saxons. At the end, they did it once for all. Saxony doesn't rebel anymore, but it costed a freaking lot of sweat and blood, and the very first expeditions of the Franks in Saxony were essentially had a negative balance. They had lost more than what they had gained. So also the perseverance of the Franks is interesting, because it got it done at the end of the day. But when you have a very few warriors, they're also spatially scattered. So that's also what it kind of influences the reaction, because at that point, if you have to cope with an army of enemies that is very determined, has planned to go through these territories, and you're a single lord that lives in a castle, the next lord that is a kind of professional of war, that can fight with armor on horseback, like you, is kind of, I don't know, 5 kilometers away. It's difficult to organize the situation, and maybe you're even enemy with that lord, because there is a weak political, a weak central authority, and therefore there is no political cohesion. And so what you do is not that to go out there in open field to meet the enemy most of the times. But what you do is just you enclose yourself into your moat until the raid is passed. You try to shelter your peasants within the palisade and stuff like that, to feed them for how much the supplies and you have stocked in your seigneurial warehouse can, and everything goes back the way it was. By the way, considering also that for doesn't matter how frequent these second invasions could get, they were still relatively rare. I mean, they happened at several years a distance one from the other. They made massive damage, structurally speaking, something you could be really felt for generations. So it was a disaster. This messed up the whole society. But actually, the most frequent military operations were not the ones that had to cope with these attacks, but rather the ones that, you know, the various local lords carried out one against each other. By the way, consider just another point on castellation, that actually the castles that were built to cope with these second invasions were mostly placed in areas like mountain passes, points of passage, and they were emergential in nature. They were smaller structures than the usual. They were abandoned after these invaders had passed. The bigger castles were built in these big plains where they could control all the peasantry around and all this stuff, and those are the ones kind of survived, over which also larger castles were built. But just for saying that encapsulation wasn't really triggered most of the times by the invasion power, but by this local warfare that existed between within the nobility. So the scarcity of professional warriors and the lack of a central authority, well, it's pretty evident. This brings to a lack of reaction. So it's not about the efficiency of the single warrior. It's about the fact that these warriors do not mingle pretty much, even though also in here progressively professionalism went in parallel with the collective training as well. So there were these small bodies of cavalrymen who were kind of well trained on their own, could also intervene quickly with a quick reaction force, because, by the way, we are plenty of evidence, of course, of Franks who coped with the who kind of went out there meeting these invaders and fought them and died and so on. So cavalry was important, especially in lands like France, but more or less everywhere actually, to move quickly. On the video on the capitulary of Charles the Bald, you realize that what the king was doing with capitulary was issuing a general cavalry levy. He wasn't interested in infantry anymore, because he wanted a quick reaction, quickly reactive force to be drawn that in this sense had its strategical reason to be mounted, because it could go very far in a few times, so it could intervene more readily. But still, weapons and horses cost, and they cost pretty dearly. And not only, because people think, what do you need to have in terms of economical resources to train a knight? Well, just weapon and a horse, and maybe feeding them, of course, which is already an enormous cost on its own as well. Definitely, weapons and armors at this time were extremely costly. Only tens of farms could work together to build something like an armor, like a coat of mail, a sword, something like that. And also metal was lacking consistently. It took a lot to be extracted, that's why also in now the main areas of sword making was in the Upper Rhine Valley. But there was also a lot of metal export, of weaponry export in some ways. Actually, it's not that weapons lacked in Europe, because actually Europe began to sell weapons, paradoxically, and this is interesting, to the same Second Invaders. When you see Saracens, Vikings, that you realize many swords were actually bought from the same Franks. So also this tells you, by the way, how complicated was actually, and non-dichotomic was the interaction between the Franks and the Second Invaders. But what you need, and it is often scarcely considered, and it actually made probably the greatest cost for training a knight in absolute terms, was that these guys had to spend a lifetime, literally since childhood, to be trained, to become warriors. I mean, these guys really, this is what really distinguished the professionals from the others. It's not even actually the technical element, like being armored, knowing how to go on horseback, but knowing how to fight repeatedly. What could the peasant infantry do? The peasant infantry had been used by, generally peasant infantry was still part of the general levy, of course, but you realize how it was discarded. Actually, since early medieval times, this tribal levy had, especially with the sedentarization of the Germanic populations, had declined in military effectiveness. Especially in places like Gaul, basically, especially in the most Romanized lands, indeed, these levies were kind of useless. I mean, they could make mass, they could help as pioneers, they could in logistics, but they had lost the practice of arms. These guys didn't live anymore in the German swamps and forests to make raids, to hunt, to live. They plowed the land, and usually for someone else, in a equal juridical condition, let's say. And in fact, what you see is that at the rise of the Carolingians, peasant levies were pretty much. It's mostly, if I'm not wrong, although it could be right, it's under Charlemagne that the infantry tries to be the infantry levy is reissued consistently, because at that point the empire had overstretched. So the main problem that Charlemagne saw as impelling now was to garrison all the provinces that had been conquered. So the local peasant levy could work like this. I mean, occupying a certain fortress could be done effectively also by peasants, because the limits of war at the time, logistically, obsidianly speaking, were, that you could man an enormous fortress even with very few people and holding off a massive attack. So the idea was that this kind of peasant militia had to be issued once again, but it's generally a failure all over the empire, because these are, first of all, people who were taken away from local, business. So they were essentially, arms were taken away from the land for working the land and producing resources. It was also kind of a problem. Sending a peasant to fight equated also to lose the resources that he could produce as a peasant, that he knew how to do while he didn't know how to be a warrior, fundamentally. And what you see is that during the 9th century, also these peasant levies completely decline. We've seen it with the capitulary of Charles the Bald. What these Frankish kings now were mostly interested in was having cavalry, and the peasantry usually didn't have much cavalry. So this was also an elite, at least numerically speaking. These weren't, cavalry was naturally not made up just by the single nobleman that had castles. It were all the retinues that were paid by the noblemen, usually already at this time. And and therefore these peasant levies progressively disappear, or at least they have just an auxiliary and secondary role that makes you understand that they weren't very, very, very useful, and that at that point, for that kind of warfare was developing in the 9th and 10th century, was better to have just these mounted retinues that could specialize this hit and run, I would say, strategy rather than tactics, because mostly from a tactical point of view, they were developing now for carrying out cavalry charges actually to impact consistently the enemy, but also in their charges were done back and forth several times, so it's kind of a hit and run at the same time. And hit as well also with throwing weapons, because cavalry at this time also made still consistent use of javelins and stuff like to soften up the enemy lines. Just remember that the Carolingian armies had still at this time infantry in the populations of other in the armies of other populations was consistently strong. I mean, think about the defeat of Zunta come at Saxon hands on the Franks. That was a defeat of Frankish cavalry against Saxon infantry. So there were peoples who were kind of still problematic. The Vikings had kind of strong infantry, for instance. So this also had to be considered. Naturally, infantry never disappeared also to the Carolingian armies. It made the numerical bulk of the army at all times. The cavalry remained an elite in the truest sense of the word, both numerically and qualitatively speaking. Also, infantry is less mobile, strategically and also tactically, but it's evident, and it's dramatic to make. There's also this process through which, in fact, Frankish society had gone specializing throughout all the Carolingian times since the 8th centuries, that the professional elite in this sense literally lives just for war, which means that all these what the Franks basically did for more than 1 century uninterruptedly was every single year, even for multiple times in a year, to make military campaigns back and forth on the frontiers of the empire that was enormous, as we've seen. So it needed troops that could participate to the army, that could stay away for a long time. So usually this was the perfect, having a mounted fighter that does that for his lifetime, so it doesn't have to work, it just have to be maintained by the peasantry, is the reason why Frankish society orientated its way, and why the Vassallatic-Beneficiary system rose from. The beneficium was essentially a prepaid service at that point, but because a prepaid salary fundamentally that was entrusted to the count, to which the king entrusted the land, to say, okay, now you draw what you need from that land in terms of money for your armor, for your horse, for your training, and you follow me to battle. This is it, and that already entails that there is someone who has to work for that night. So Frankish society was very stratified, arguably since the late Roman Empire, without any discontinuity. So this was already there in the air. In this sense, the Carolingians didn't actually invent anything. They simply implemented a system that already kind of existed, and they transformed it in what we know eventually. But this already passed through the impoverishment of the freemen and fundamentally their subjection to this dominate, to these masters that already in pre-Carolingian times were very aristocratic and elite in military terms in this world. So how can you move a peasant, and what for especially, with all the costs attached for feeding, for equipping, etc., from a frontier to a frontier, even at 1,000 kilometers of distance across Europe, to make it go to war? What for? It's better for that guy to pay some sum of money for an amount of his crop for a night to go fight in his place. And actually, this is present in all recruitment laws in all over Europe this time. That normally even the general levy didn't quite issue the mobilization of all the peasantry. It was just like one guy over 3, with the other 2 that had to pay for his equipment and food, etc. And consider that at this time, basically, also the Carolingians So theoretically, the state, that was also, however, still very private in nature, never forget this, arranged great masses of agricultural surplus on its own, meaning that, to complement the resources that theoretically had to be provided by the single levy to go to war for himself, fundamentally. So there was already, in this broader picture, in these great Atlantic plains of Europe, of northwestern Europe, where the Carolingian empires, the core at least of the Carolingian empire, stretched, this huge amount of resources there, the Carolingians had already in their hands, given the stratification of society that could draw to make their army function, even on this kind of private asset, because the Carolingians actually believed that the Frankish kingdom was their personal property, just like the Merovingians had thought it. So this is very important to make you understand what the general mindset and accordingly the system got really was in this world. So on the long run, there is this transformation that the old Germans would have found to be a slave one, fundamentally, a servile one, of a harmless people, fundamentally, rustic people, that was just committed in producing the necessary resources for those who will protect him. Now, in the Germanic freeman's mentality, this pertained to the slaves, to the serfs, to the non-men, because technically slaves were not men. And the true man was a freeman, because he had been entrusted by the Aryan deity the glory that had deserved for some reason. Who had been defeated was useless. It was just like an object. So this tells you really how much societies have changed even throughout and these centuries. And my opinion is that the Carolingian times brutally accelerated this, and this acceleration took place especially through war, because war fundamentally fueled this system and pushed society, transformed society towards that direction. Because this system went on and on and on and on. If you read the Carolingian the Frankish chronicles of Carolingian times, you realize that the exception was that in 1 year there was no military expedition, because for the rest, all the other years, the normal thing was to go to war. So this is a social transformation that actually happens in many times in history. It's just like with the Romans at the time of, in the Middle Republic, where there is still the idea of the peasant soldier was still alive. Then there is this massive Second Punic War that accelerates brutally. It's fought also on the Italic soil. It kind of changes all the society. And this model collapses. So eventually there is professionalism kicking in, and the rest of the population kind of grows deresponsabilized. It grows less warrior-like in fashion. So this happens in the Frankish world as well, obviously in a very different way, but still with the same process, and it can be observed everywhere. And this is naturally also a consequence of the sedentarization of the, if you want to look at from a migration era perspective, the sedentarization of all these tribal peoples that had lived into a sort of semi-nomadic fashion, where war and loot and raids were the base of life, fundamentally. And then while they sedentarized in the richer areas of Europe, they become peasants because it's more profitable even for them. But there are also other factors that bring this peasantry not to be so free once again, that society is ruled by increasingly ruled by an elite that throughout the centuries will become in fact the feudal elite, and this started in fact from Carolingian times fundamentally, at least on a regular basis, and exported into these other lands that the Carolingians conquered. Quite importantly, we have seen it in Germany, in Italy, etc. So these are kind of the dynamics that put the social basis for the differentiation of the mounted elite from the ancient indistinguished class of the free warriors slash agriculturers. This happens from the Frankish world and then is exported abroad, as we have just said. And never to forget, there is also this other important element that is first institutional, then it really happens on many levels: political, social, institutional, economical, etc., and juridical, finally, which is probably also the most important, as at least to put a sanction for formalization at the end of the process. That is in fact the formalization of the servile lifestyle. That is, that fundamentally the world that is formed in post-Carolingian Europe is a seigneurial world into which the peasants, albeit being still theoretically free, they have very heavy encumbrances for which their lifestyle become essentially a servile one. And even their juridical condition is fundamentally obliges them to follow that rule. So actually in this world there is never something like, now the peasant transforms itself into a serf, so a non-freeman, unless, I don't know, you had committed a crime and therefore you lost your freedom, which also happened if you were a slave of war or something like that. But fundamentally it's mostly the freemen that suffer this progressively, because de facto, because their lifestyle is increasingly burdened by these exactions that the lords ask, actually on behalf of themselves, because central authority, as we've seen, was not there anymore. So these guys now did what they do just on the basis of their relation of force, always given that the dialectics between the lord and the peasant communities was very, very active. So it's not that the peasants lost actually their freedom from a day to another. Actually, the worst in this happened at the very end of the Middle Ages, actually, and up to the 14th century the peasantry was also pretty active and dangerous and dynamic, and also military. Yeah, there was some kind of the elite was the elite, but theoretically the peasantry could still do something, which they didn't, but most of the times, but because of their condition of inferiority, in which they had been relegated politically, socially, and even psychologically, but also juridically, for which you were by law tied to your land, because you owed something to your lord for defending you. This is how feudal Europe is born, fundamentally, and it passed through war. I believe that at least war was a major factor into the change in the process, in the acceleration of this process, in the speeding up of this process, because this process actually, in my opinion, was happening already before, and it's normal. We have seen how when the migration era ends, the transformations are occurring by nature, physiologically speaking, but war did accelerate it, and the second invasions do accelerate it, and society grows, transforms into this fashion, and it has this massive change that will come to characterize fundamentally the ancien regime until the 18th, the 19th centuries, and the 20th sometimes, and so yeah, this is where it passed from, because war is costly. There is a very strongly brutal historical materialism behind this conception. This classes really of peasants impoverished themselves dramatically during centuries like especially the 9th, because I believe that's the moment where the major clashes in fact occurred. The 10th century was also very harsh, but in the 9th century the same Carolingians put in motion a freaking lot of resources actually to fight each other, and the main wars were fought within the same Frankish soil. So, or better, the imperial soil. So the local populations were the ones that suffered pretty harsh, and we know this, that even the Carolingian conquest brought to this kind of social disruption from which the elite was ultra advantaged and the middle classes were fundamentally disappearing, becoming all peasants, and eventually getting this de facto servile living condition. So I hope that I stop it here. Naturally, there is much to discuss about this topic, but I'm glad today I could deliver this, and I will open some other time to the actual stories of the several kingdoms, post-Carolingian kingdoms, and their stories and how they coped with this, the second invasions and so on. This was just an introduction. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, share this video. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content, so you can get simply my videos, popping out in the home of your YouTube account, and that what subscription basically means. And for now, as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.